What if the most intelligent creature watching you walk to work every morning isn't another human? It's the crow sitting on that telephone wire. Scientists just used artificial intelligence to eavesdrop on crow conversations for the very first time, capturing over 127,000
For centuries, we assumed the crow on the wire was watching us and understanding nothing. We assumed the same about every bird that ever perched above a parking lot or a schoolyard, dismissing them as background noise, as feathered furniture in the landscape of human life. But a team of scientists working in the forests of northern Spain has just spent a breeding season proving that assumption catastrophically wrong. And the tool they used to do it wasn't a microphone pointed at the sky. It was artificial intelligence, trained to hear things human ears were never built to catch, and what it found buried inside the quiet chatter of a crow family is forcing researchers to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the line we drew between human language and animal noise was never really there at all? To understand why this discovery matters, you have to first understand what kind of animal we're actually dealing with, because the crow is not the animal most people think it is. It is not a bird operating purely on instinct, snatching food, and reacting to danger with nothing behind its eyes but reflex. Crows solve problems that stump primates. They build tools rather than simply finding them, shaping wire into hooks and selecting sticks of precise length and rigidity for specific tasks. They cache food and then, if they suspect they were watched while hiding it, they return later and move it, a behavior that requires understanding that another mind holds information it shouldn't have. That is a concept psychologists call theory of mind, and for most of scientific history it was treated as something almost sacredly human, something only we and perhaps our closest primate cousins could manage. Crows do it with feathers instead of hands. Then there is the matter of memory and grudges. In Seattle, researchers at the University of Washington ran an experiment where a specific rubber mask was worn by a person capturing and banding wild crows. Years passed. The researchers stopped wearing the mask entirely. And still, crows that had never personally been captured, crows that hadn't even been born yet when the original trapping happened, began diving and scolding anyone who wore that same mask. The fear had been taught, passed from parent to offspring, spread through a social network of birds who had learned that a particular face meant danger. That is not a hardwired reflex. That is culture, in the exact technical sense biologists use the word. Information transmitted across generations through social learning rather than genetics. It's the same basic mechanism that carries human traditions, warnings, and stories forward through time, just running on a completely different nervous system. And yet, despite decades of documenting this kind of sophistication, scientists had almost no real insight into what crows were actually saying to each other while they did all of this. We could observe the behavior. We could not hear the conversation underneath it. That gap between visible intelligence and invisible communication is exactly what a new research effort set out to close. And the answer to why it took so long is more interesting than you'd expect. The work centers on a population of carrion crows that has been studied for years by behavioral ecologist Daniela Canestrari and her longtime research partner Vicente Baglione. These particular birds do something unusual for European crows. Instead of raising chicks in isolated pairs, they practice cooperative breeding, meaning extended family units, parents, older siblings from previous years, and sometimes more distant relatives, all work together to raise each new generation. Duties get divided among the group. Some birds guard the nest while others forage. They coordinate responses to predators, manage feeding schedules, and make what amount to collective decisions about risk and safety across a breeding season that stretches for months. That kind of complex, distributed cooperation should require rich communication to function at all, and Canestrari had suspected for years that it did. The problem was that traditional recording equipment, microphones set up near nests to capture the ambient soundscape, mostly picked up the loud, carrying caws crows are famous for. Those loud calls are the ones that made it into folklore and horror movies. But Canestrari believed the real substance of crow social life was happening in a quieter register entirely, in close-range exchanges between birds who already knew each other intimately, conversations too soft and too intimate for any distant microphone to ever catch. That's where the AI came in, developed through a partnership with the Earth Species Project, a nonprofit that sits at the intersection of artificial intelligence research and wildlife conservation, built around one audacious goal: using machine learning to decode the communication systems of non-human animals. Their engineering team, working under AI research director Olivier Payetkin, built a detection model that borrows its core logic from computer vision. In image recognition, an algorithm learns to draw boxes around objects in a photograph, identifying where a car or a face begins and ends within the frame. The team adapted that same principle to sound. Instead of drawing boxes around cars, their model draws temporal boxes around vocalizations in an audio spectrogram, marking precisely where each sound starts and stops, even when several crows are calling at once and their voices overlap into what would otherwise be an undifferentiated wall of noise. That capability turned out to be essential, because a real crow family interacting at a nest is loud and layered. Adults calling, chicks begging, neighboring birds challenging boundaries, and occasionally a parasitic cuckoo trying to interject. No human researcher could realistically untangle that volume of overlapping sound by ear. The AI could. To actually gather the sound, the team didn't rely on distant microphones at all. They fitted the crows themselves with small, lightweight biologging devices, sophisticated enough to record high-fidelity audio, track movement through built-in accelerometers, and store enormous amounts of data, all without disrupting the bird's normal behavior. Before deploying the devices as part of the main study, the researchers spent hundreds of hours reviewing nest camera footage, specifically to confirm the loggers weren't changing how the crows acted or how successfully they raised their chicks. Once satisfied the devices were safe, they let the birds simply live, and the equipment listened from inside the family itself, from the nest, from ground level, from the crow's own vantage point. Across a single breeding season, that setup captured more than 127,000 distinct vocalizations. And the first finding, the one that arrived before researchers had even started interpreting individual sounds, reshaped the entire picture of what crow communication actually is. The overwhelming majority of those 127,000 calls were not the loud, far-carrying caws that had defined crow vocal research for decades. They were quiet, soft, low-amplitude sounds exchanged at close range, murmurs that any traditional recording setup positioned even a short distance away would have missed completely. The loud call, the one everyone associates with crows, turned out to be a small fraction of their actual vocal life. Essentially the shouting on top of a much deeper and much quieter conversation running underneath it the whole time. Sit with what that actually means. Decades of scientific literature on crow communication were built almost entirely on the loudest, most public fraction of what crows say to each other. The equivalent of trying to understand a human community by studying only its fire alarms and stadium cheers, while remaining totally unaware that the real social fabric was being built in quiet conversations happening in kitchens and on evening walks. The data wasn't wrong. It was radically incomplete, and the missing piece may be the piece that mattered most all along. This changes how we have to think about crow cognition. A rich, close-range vocal life implies a level of relational intimacy that cooperative breeding almost certainly requires. Raising chicks as an extended family unit doesn't run on occasional alarm calls. It runs on constant, fine-grained coordination between individuals who understand each other's tendencies, histories, and moment-to-moment states. A soft murmur passed between two adult crows at the edge of a nest is very likely carrying specific, contextual, relational information, and both producing and correctly interpreting that kind of signal demands real cognitive sophistication. Encoding meaning into sound, transmitting it through a channel built for intimate exchange, and having it received and decoded in a way that changes the listener's behavior. That is, by any honest definition, what communication does. Crows appear to be doing exactly that, in a register we never even knew existed. The Earth Species Project isn't stopping at crows. Parallel research programs are underway on beluga whales, elephants, and multiple songbird species, all selected for their social complexity. Across every one of these projects, a consistent pattern keeps emerging. AI models trained on the acoustic structure of human speech are finding organized, meaningful patterns in animal vocalizations too, suggesting that the deep architecture of communication, the way information gets packaged, transmitted, and received, might be a far more universal feature of intelligence than we've historically been willing to accept. The Earth Species Project's audio model, trained on recordings spanning hundreds of species, works on a simple but powerful bet. If you show an AI enough examples of an animal communicating across enough different contexts, it will learn which sounds consistently carry information, which combinations of sounds precede which behavioral outcomes, and which acoustic patterns cluster together under specific conditions in ways that map onto the animal's actual social world. Not translation in the dictionary sense of the word, but something more fundamental, the mapping of sound to meaning, of signal to the reality it represents. And what keeps surfacing, again and again, are structural features that look remarkably similar to the building blocks linguists have identified in human language. Not identical words, not identical grammar, but combinatorial logic, smaller units assembling into larger ones to produce meanings that neither piece carries alone. Referential capacity, the ability of a signal to point to a specific thing, individual, or state in the world. Social embedding, where meaning shifts depending on the relationship and history between the communicators. African elephants use individualized calls that function essentially as names for specific group members. Sperm whales produce clicking patterns that differ systematically between social groups, functioning almost like regional dialects that are learned by young whales from the group they grow up in rather than inherited genetically, the same basic way a human child picks up the accent of the community around them. And now crows, arguably the most thoroughly studied non-primate species in cognitive science, are revealing a vocal world so much richer than anything previous tools could access that researchers are openly reconsidering baseline assumptions about corvid intelligence that have stood for years. Scientists studying this are careful, and rightly so. The field of animal cognition has a long history of overclaiming, of researchers reading human meaning into animal behavior because they wanted it to be there. But there's a real difference between overclaiming and following the evidence honestly, and the evidence accumulating across species after species, using increasingly powerful AI tools, is pointing consistently in one direction. The sharp boundary we drew between ourselves and every other animal, language and genuine meaning on our side, instinct and mechanical signal on theirs, is starting to look less like a fact about the world and more like a story we told ourselves to feel singular. The crow on the telephone wire never cared about that story. It has been living a complex, coordinated, communicatively rich life the entire time, regardless of what we believed about it. It likely recognized your face after the second or third time you walked beneath it. It noted what you were carrying and how quickly you were moving. It made a quiet sound to a family member nearby, one an AI can finally detect, and that family member responded, adjusting its behavior in some small but deliberate way. We still don't know exactly what that sound meant, but for the first time, we know with real certainty that it meant something. And that raises a heavier question than the science itself. If crows turn out to have a communication system with genuine structural complexity, our ethical relationship with them has to shift. We can no longer treat them as reactive biological machines producing hardwired noise. We have to acknowledge that we share our streets, our parks, our telephone wires with beings that have perspectives, that communicate about those perspectives, and that have spent the entire span of human civilization trying to make themselves understood in a language we simply lack the tools to hear. The Earth Species Project frames this discovery not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a chance to finally understand the animals we've shared the planet with all along, and to build conservation strategies, early warning systems, and even city designs that account for the communicative, social lives happening all around us. But underneath the practical applications is something harder to quantify and arguably more significant. The possibility that the world was never the quiet, human-centered place we assumed it to be. It has always been crowded with minds. The crow is still calling. We're only just now starting to listen.